Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Andy Saldana. I'm the Executive Director of New York Tech Alliance, which is a nonprofit here in New York City connecting the tech community, promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion to the New York tech ecosystem. Today we have a fantastic program set up for you, led by Micah from Grasshopper Bank and featuring Genevieve Ryan Bellaire from Realworld. She's awesome. Also a New York Tech alumni, really fantastic presenter, founder, everything amazing. Before we kick things off though, I just want to say a few quick thank yous to our annual partners that make our work possible, and tell you about a few upcoming events. Thank you to our wonderful annual partners, everybody from Xander, CUNY, Witham, Grasshopper Bank, CEO's Right Hand, Verizon, Nation Builder. They all, again, allow us to do the work that we do in the community and support our programming as well. Again, a very special shout out to Grasshopper Bank for helping with the series, the Founder Spotlights. They've been such a great partner this last year, especially during this pandemic time, helping bring founders together, having the conversations that we're looking for, and then featuring some amazing founders. And then our next upcoming events, on Tuesday, September the 15th is our next New York Tech Meetup. We're kicking off the fall with a celebration of assistive tech, hearing impaired assistive technology. So we hope that you can join us on Tuesday, September the 15th at 5:30 p.m. And then on Thursday, September the 24th at noon, we're going to have a lunchtime session of financing forum. You can always find these events on our website at nytech.org/our-events. And then October, we will be continuing the Founder Spotlight sessions with Dr. Emily Anhalt, the founder of COA. And we'll be announcing that date in the next week or so. And then that brings us to today's event. I'm going to turn it over to Micah from Grasshopper and Genevieve to continue the conversation. I'm going to disappear from camera, but I'll be in the background. If you need anything, please find me in the chat.
Thanks, Andy. By the way, you should change the name of your work from home playlist to just work.
Yeah, just work. Exactly.
I was getting some song tips from there too. I was like, oh, this is a great list. It's like,
yeah. Awesome. So let me set some ground rules for sort of what we do over this next hour. This is not a time to think about bad things. This is a time to think about good things and talk about really interesting decisions that founders have made as they've built their companies, either through experience, sometimes through mistakes, sometimes through successes. It really is an opportunity to learn. So what we want to do is talk about the journey, and then try to pull out some tactical experiences that we can impart on folks, that you can walk away from this with something you can add to your quiver, so that you're able to go off and build your own businesses bigger and better and faster. We do try to keep it very positive. We also try to keep it very informal. So if throughout the conversation something pops and you want to ask a question, either raise your hand with a little blue button or come off mute and interrupt. I will pause a couple times throughout the hour to ask for questions. Don't feel bad if you don't have any questions, but do feel bad if you have one and don't ask it, because these hours are fleeting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Genevieve to do an introduction of herself, because she will always introduce herself better than I could, and want to know a little bit about the company, a little bit about why you started it, and a little bit about the future.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me today, Grasshopper, Andy, everybody. Mia, it's so nice to be here with you all, and excited to share more about Realworld and the story from the beginning and sort of the present, and then where we're going in the future. I always like to just talk a little bit about what Realworld is first, because I think our founding story is very much wrapped in the vision of what we see ourselves building. Realworld is a centralized platform, marketplace, and community to navigate adulthood and big life moments, starting with what we see as the first life moment, which is graduating from school and really starting your first job. and decided to found this business a couple of years ago because I failed at that life moment, sort of entering my first role after graduating from school. And I was in a position where I was really lucky to have an amazing education. I'm a lawyer by background. I have my MBA. But when I started working, I realized that a lot of the foundational fundamentals across personal finance, healthcare, taxes, retirement savings, leases, all of the sort of adulting life stuff were totally new to me. There were things that I'd never learned in the classroom, and I'd been in school for long enough that I hadn't really experienced on the job quite yet. And so I made just tons of mistakes across my early 20s, everything from forgetting to enroll in health insurance during open enrollment, to not really understanding exactly how to budget, to having, issues with my lease, sort of across these different topics. And I'm the oldest kid in my family, so I didn't really have the older sibling who was kind of giving me the play-by-play when it came to making these different decisions. And so I did what most people do, which is turn to my parents and then turn to Google, and started just trying to figure out in some way for someone to tell me, how do you be a successful young adult? What are the things you need to know across these different topics to really successfully launch into life in the real world? And what I found was tons of articles across everything from which credit card is the right card for you, or, how to compare health insurance plans and things like that, that were totally impersonal and long form and sort of not engaging. And then lots of products and services across categories that were really helping you figure out one single solution. So great companies like Lemonade for renters insurance, or Oscar for healthcare, or One Medical. But as someone who was really just starting out, these were all really unfamiliar to me, and I didn't really understand exactly how they came together, or have really necessarily the foundational education to realize that I should be thinking about these different things, or I should be building my credit or starting to save for retirement and the like. And so what was missing in the market, and really what we're trying to build, is that centralized place, almost like a single sign-on for the real world, where you can navigate those different questions across these different topics in your early 20s and beyond, prepare for life moments like starting your first job, or moving, or paying back your student loans, or becoming financially independent, and really have the education, tools, and sort of vetted resources there for you to make smart decisions, but in a customized way, where we're proactively helping you take the next step. And so the company today very much tries to do that. We started with education, and I can talk a little bit more about sort of the early days, but we started with really what we found was the missing piece, which was just knowledge across all these different topics. Ended up actually partnering with colleges and universities across the country to essentially provide kind of a course that was everything you didn't learn in the college curriculum, that covered everything from credit and debt to understanding the basics of insurance, to really, how to sign your first lease, etc. And we provide that now to about 50 colleges across the country. And the product itself has emerged and evolved from a course to a much more engaging platform with, actionable to-do lists and resources, to really now what we see is sort of this sidekick in your pocket, helping you navigate these different questions. And the vision here is really much bigger than just helping you set the building blocks across your life, but it's really to be sort of a trusted partner for you as you go through life moments, whether it's switching jobs, or going back to graduate school, or buying a car, buying a house, getting married, having kids, all of these moments where there's lots of different decisions to make, and they're unfamiliar, most likely, and new to you, and lots of friction there. But we hope that through our platform and sort of our community, we can help you in just setting yourself up for success.
Awesome. Makes me think a lot about when I was thinking about going to college. My parents didn't know anything about. My mom's from Israel, and like nobody really knew what college was, and like little things like, what's a fraternity? Is that something you should be a part of? How do you select majors, and what do you do post? How did you decide what the first guide was?
The first place to start. So what we actually did, as soon as this idea started to come into focus, we went straight to users and did a ton of user testing. So we interviewed about 1,000 college seniors and recent graduates in that first year of really building out this concept, to start identifying the patterns as to what were the top 100 questions that people were asking. And of those, which categories were they most focused in? Were they financial questions? Were they work-related questions? Were they just, moving questions? What were they? And we kind of came down to these big 5 buckets that housed all of those different questions in some capacity or another. And those were finance, health, work-related questions, government-related questions, and then this kind of catch-all category we call life, which right now on our platform is really focused on your living experience in your first year out, but ultimately will be things like trust and estates and wills and all sorts of other stuff. And what we realized from the beginning was that in order to really solve the problem that we're focused on, which is being that sort of guide to help you navigate the real world, we couldn't focus in on a specific topic. We couldn't really just take like budgeting, for example, because there's plenty of resources out there that help you with budgeting specifically. We couldn't do just understanding health insurance. There's plenty of companies out there that do that. But what was really missing was this platform-oriented approach where we focused on a life moment. We focused on a single user's experience. And so we decided to take a broad approach in terms of topic, but a very narrow approach in terms of who we're serving. And so ended up focusing on that 21 to 23-year-old who's really starting out at life after school. But it was 100% from user testing and sort of pattern matching.
Let's talk a little bit about user testing. I think that's a great tactic to extract. What was the actual, how did you go about doing it? Like, did you physically go interview 1,000 people? Did you write surveys? Did you buy, like SurveyMonkey? What are they called? Like when you get a group of people through
things like that.
Yeah, and all those things. Like, how did you go about and actually do it?
Yeah, so this definitely was like a mess. It was very messy in the beginning. And I think it's always important to say that when you talk to people, because the early stages of businesses are super messy. You're sort of validating, invalidating things. You're trying to make something happen from nothing. So what we did, and what I think ultimately ended up working very effectively, was we started with just surveys, just trying to get a basis. Is this really a problem? Is this just in our head? Is this something that is, more, is there something more interesting here? And those were more broad brush questions. So do you feel prepared for life after school? Have you actually been taught what these different topics are across credit, debt, taxes, etc.? And then from there, we actually sat down and did user testing or user interviews, just conversations like this, 15-minute increments. I did like 10 of them a day, like 9 or 10 of them a day, and just got a Calendly link, or I don't even think at that time I used Calendly, but something like that, and just had slots that people could book. And I had a sister at the time who was graduating from school, and so all of her friends were in that moment that we were trying to tackle. And so I had a nice base of people initially to go and speak with. And the way that I ended every conversation was, could you introduce me to one other person your age who might be interested in speaking with me about this, whether that's a cousin of yours or a high school friend or a camp friend, whoever it is, but how can we kind of like keep that wheel going? And it just turned out to be very effective because it allowed, from a sort of scale perspective, to really reach a ton of people pretty quickly. But it also allowed us to have like more meaningful conversations with people around these different topics that you just can't get from surveys. I mean, you can get, if you have a very specific hypothesis you're trying to validate or invalidate, surveys are great because they can give you black and white information. But I think in the early days when you're still trying to figure out what do we even build to solve this problem, it's a lot more nuanced and there's a lot more just kind of conversation that needs to happen. And so from a just organizational perspective, after having these conversations or during these conversations, I'd basically have a screen with an Excel doc that would have specific questions and type in people's answers. And then the end of every week, we'd go back through, look at this document and sort of figure out, okay, where are their patterns? Where are the same thing that people are saying over and over again? Or what's really interesting here? Did anyone say something that I wasn't expecting? And based upon that week's, this is getting very granular, but based upon that week's sort of testing, reformat those questions and do it all over again for the next week. And I did this for really about like 6 months in the early days. I was an entrepreneur in residence out of a foundation in DC, and they just gave me the space and time to kind of do this effectively. But it made a huge difference because it proved, first, that there was really something there, and second, that there wasn't really a competitive solution out there. Because when we asked how people typically navigated these questions, it was exactly what I had done, which was ask your parents or look online, or ask an older sibling or someone like that.
Do you think that every company, as they're sort of developing product, even if they have a product in market, that user testing is something, customer development is something to implement?
Absolutely. So in the last 2 weeks, I can tell you we've done 20 user tests. So we're actually rolling out a modified version of our existing product just from a user experience type of perspective. And we wanted to start testing it. And so we went back and got a whole new batch of new users to test. And so I think no matter what stage of the life cycle you're in, it's so important to either have a consistent user base that you're asking these questions to, or new users that you can sort of test out these different topics with. Because when you're so deep in the solution, when you have spent all this time building something, the mistake I think that people make, and we definitely made as well in the beginning, is that you're building for yourselves as opposed to building for your user. And so sometimes those are one and the same, if you're lucky, and that's when you get product market fit and things go really well, but oftentimes they're not. And so if you can get really wedded to your solution in a way that you're almost trying to push it onto users as opposed to listening to what they want and building for them, you can sort of run into trouble. So I think having a really healthy culture of just constantly validating and invalidating even small changes to your product or your messaging or your pricing or anything that you're doing is super, super important.
And how do you think of that in terms of, the belief that as a founder, you're supposed to be building super fast and building quickly and hyper growth? Like, it sounds like to do, effective customer development, you sort of have to pause and sort of take a step backwards. Are you able to keep the pedal to the metal while you're doing customer development?
Yeah, I mean, I think two things. I think direction is more important than speed. It's one thing to be going a million miles an hour, but the wrong direction. So I think there's like a healthy balance you have to just to balance there. But I would say, I think the ability to test things is actually a lot easier now than it even was like 2 years ago when I started this business, because you have the ability to just put screens that are, on Figma or Envision or something else in front of users and get their feedback on them without them being live, fully coded, any sort of prototype or anything like that. And so a lot of the elements that you're trying to test, you can test in a really lightweight way. I mean, you could do it physically on paper, you could do it in a lot of different ways in front of your user base. And so I think there's a balance to be struck where maybe you get enough validation on something in a really lightweight way and then actually build it out and see if the market takes. But it's definitely I think it's a dance. And I think it's also, it depends on the type of business that you're in. If you are building a new type of next gen sneaker company, that at least the core element of the product, a sneaker is sort of there's probably some iterations you need to do, but ultimately you have a good enough sense as to the direction you're going in terms of building it. And it's more around the messaging and the brand voice and sort of your own ethos as a company and your, sales channels and things like that. Versus if you're creating a whole new product category, which is what we feel like we're doing, there's not another competitor in the market right now doing what we're doing at this time, that it's a little bit more agile. You kind of have to take 2 steps forward, 1 step back in terms of bringing something to market.
And what's the most surprising thing that you have found through doing customer development?
Most surprising thing. I think, to be honest, something that we kind of touched on earlier, or something that we landed on early, was that this was actually like the space that we're tackling, kind of navigating your first job life after school, was consistently like an embarrassing thing for a lot of young people, that they didn't know what these different topics were, or they didn't understand how to fill out paperwork or really understand credit cards or any of these different topics. And it was sort of this like huge secret that no one understands those different things when they're graduating and starting out, and that we knew that, but a lot of young people didn't know that. And so one of the reasons why a product like this perhaps didn't exist previously, or that there really wasn't something there before that was solving this problem, was that people didn't necessarily admit to having the problem. It was kind of something that was like a quiet struggle that they figured out on their own, or truly just, relied on parents or someone else in their life to support. So I think the emotional attachment to something or the emotional lens to something that we really thought is much more tactical, how can we help you set up these different building blocks, was surprising. And it's one of the reasons why our company itself, if you go to realworldplaybook.com, you'll see it doesn't look like a financial services website. It doesn't look like a, really kind of technical site. It looks like a really fun consumer brand, because we spent a lot of time trying to create an element and sort of change the point of view and perspective around graduating and starting your first job as something really exciting, working towards independence and being something that is aspirational as opposed to scary, which is sort of what the sentiment was in the market at the time.
So just as a reminder, relatively informal session. So if you have questions, feel free to jump in. And as I said, I'll pause now and again for questions, and I'll do that now for a couple seconds. If people have questions, please.
I'm kind of new to this whole thing. My name's Larry Albin. Nice to meet you all. How do you join this group? Like, if you want to be part of this group, like I just saw it online yesterday and jumped onto this today.
Andy can probably answer that question.
Yeah, so you can definitely join the New York Tech Alliance at our website, nytech.org. And this is just one of the many events that we run as part of the organization. And then this specific event happens once a month in partnership with Grasshopper. And I'd like to have Genevieve.
Do you all get access to like, startup companies that you might end up investing in, or is it just exposure?
I don't know. We can definitely talk offline. My LinkedIn is in the chat, and I'll be providing my email address, and definitely we can set up some office hours and talk through kind of what your objectives are and how we can
Please
help.
send me your email address and I'll reach out to you. Thank you.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Cool. Let's dive into the marketing side of it a little, as you sort of brought up at the very end, is that you realized that you had a different animal, right? Like you have no competitors in the space, you're building something new, and you've got to present it in a way that's different so that there's an acceptance of it in the marketplace. How are you getting in front of people who don't realize that they have a problem? Because it is, as you said, something, the big secret. How do you get in front of them? And then what is the message that you put forth that seems to be resonating? And then how did you get to that point?
Yeah, so it's a lot packed in there. That's a great question. So taking a couple steps back, we realized pretty early, just from that insight that I mentioned, that this was sort of like the secret problem space, that it probably was going to be hard to go down a traditional marketing path of like SEO optimization, or, being the first thing that comes to mind for someone when they're looking for a credit card, or they have to fill out one specific form or something online, just because there's a lot of competition through single category products. And the way that we could be most helpful was more proactively helping you sort of set these things up, and almost being this tool in your arsenal that we can help you with as you have these different questions long term. And so when you have that type of a more platform oriented approach, we decided ultimately that we needed to work with partners, that it was going to be a bigger impact for us if we could have, at least initially, sort of channel partners we could work with who could help us reach one-to-many users in a really cost-effective way. Because ultimately we needed to acquire those users to be able to grow and sort of tap into the network effects around this space, which I can talk about in a moment. And so we went where our users were, which is graduating from college. And so we ended up partnering with colleges across the country. We work now with about 50 of them, who essentially provide Realworld as a graduation gift and something that they get a membership to as a young alum in their first year out of school. And because of that, we're able to almost take one step ahead of that problem space for the user who might not even know that they need us quite yet. They get access to this tool through a trusted institution like their school, that when they do have those questions, we're almost anticipating them for them, reminding them they need to pay rent every month, reminding them when tax season's coming up, here are the documents you need to start thinking about, or open enrollment for health insurance, and sort of being that almost trusted authority in their mind before they even have the question, or at least telling them the questions they need to ask. And so the channel approach, I think, and being a B2B2C company, which is how we started, sort of shifted, which I can talk in a moment, but being a B2B2C company is huge, can be very successful, but also has some real challenges in terms of getting it right. And so the most exciting part about it is that you make one sale and then you make 1,000 sales. It's sort of a very streamlined way to get to scale quickly. It's also typically you're working with someone who, in this case, a school, is interested in paying for your product, even if the user is not likely to pay for your product. And so it's a nice way to essentially get revenue in the door, get scale quickly. The challenge, though, comes with engagement, because you ultimately have to make the same sale twice. So you have to sell to the schools that this is something of value to them, and then you also have to sell to the user that this is something of value to them. And what we found is that we could ultimately make a real pitch to that user, but it was very hard necessarily to do it through the schools. It was something that we almost had to create a brand separately around our product and really invest in the messaging and everything that we were doing on our own to be able to sort of showcase that value to the user. So to your second question is, around what is that message and how does that resonate? It took a lot of time to figure out exactly what that was. Our initial stab at it was really just being the one-stop shop for adulthood, and the one place you could go to get resources and tools around all these different topics. But the reality that we started realizing really even over the last year, and we've sort of iterated on this point, is that adulthood is still very undefined. And so it's very hard to go from 0 to 1 as a young adult when you're thinking about all of these different topics. Even if you know what you need to do, it's sort of important to realize what you're working towards. And so I mentioned this idea of independence earlier, but for us, that's really that's our brand promise to our users, that we can help you get independent. independent. We can help you figure out what we've distilled to be the first 15 decisions essentially you need to make, or 15 buckets you need to check in order to be a successful young person. And we can help you do each of those things. We provide you the resources and the tools and education and the community layer where people are sort of answering each other's questions, the service providers that we've vetted across those different topics. We can help you check off those different boxes and really almost tangibly define what it means to be at what we call essentially level 1 adulting. And of course, adulthood is, something that you continue to go through throughout life. So whether it's, these other life moments where there's new priorities or new concerns or new decisions you need to make after you have your own family or own property or whatever it might be, those are things we might be able to help you with later. But right now, we're really hyper-focused on helping you with that first step. And so I think that sense of just identifying for someone, here are the boxes you need to check, and we're going to help you check them, was actually almost necessary to get that brand promise right, to really create some definition in a sense as to how can you win on this platform. Because products, and this was something I learned, later on, but something I think is really important, is that products really are meant to do a job for the user. And sort of the question you want to ask is, what job are you doing for that user? It's not just something that they like or something that they want, but like, what job are you doing for them? And for us, our job is to kind of get you from 0 to 1 when it comes to independence, sort of like get you that first step up and really defining that for you. So even though initially, getting in front of users was really through those channel partners, what we've come to realize is that there are network effects on the product itself. And there's the ability to tap into, what is everybody else like me doing? What are the questions that they have that I might have too? And sort of starting to unpack and almost open up that kind of insight we talked about before, this big secret that nobody really knows what they're doing across this space, and create a sense of relief for people that they're not the only ones figuring things out. And so we've tried to layer into the messaging as well as to the product that sense of community where people can ask each other questions, and actually found that it's a reason now why people even come to the site. So it's a channel for us from a marketing perspective too, where people are hearing about this from their friends, or they're able to sort of take a look and see what other people are talking about and realize that they have these questions too, and we could be a solution to help them. So really getting, I think, the brand vision right, getting the messaging, and just getting sort of what does it mean to win at this product right has been critical to us, from going to just being a resource to being like a real product tool.
So I'm going to circle back around to community, because I think community is super important, both personally, and I think as startups are growing more and more, realizing that without a strong community, you don't really have a company, even if it is a B2B company, right? Like, it doesn't have to be Facebook. But what I do want to spend a moment on is channel sales, because I think for a lot of startups, and a lot of founders, they are thinking about, do I go out and spend a bunch of money on SEO and pay-per-click and blah, 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 social media marketing? Or do I go close one big deal? Like, a channel sale is not much different than an enterprise sale, generally. Can you talk a little bit about, and universities are notoriously difficult, right? Like, they're slow and thoughtful. Let's call it thoughtful instead of slow. They're very thoughtful, and they take forever. Can you talk a little bit about the process, and have you the process, like, figure out a way to shorten the sales cycle there?
Yeah, of course. To your point, universities are kind of their own beast in many ways in terms of just a channel sale or channel partners, even, as opposed to just companies like employers who we work with as well. I think the thing for us that was important was, in the early days, we wanted to involve schools in some capacity, because we felt like ultimately the buck kind of stops with schools. That's where the big problem is here. It's sort of this missing piece within the education system in our country, not just at the higher education level, but in the K through 12 level as well, that practical life skills, particularly financial literacy, are just not taught. They're not prioritized, and there's really very little going on there. So we wanted to involve schools in the beginning, and we were really lucky in the early days to have some early adopters that made all the difference in terms of getting that contract signed in 2 months as opposed to a year, which oftentimes is what happens with a school. So I think in the early days, it was really more about like the people themselves rather than even institutions, sort of finding people who resonated with the mission and had the ability to kind of take the next step and test us out. And I think the process there was a lot of just throwing paint on the wall and finding where it sticked, at least initially, and then going where those people were. So back in the world where we could actually go to conferences and do things like that, we did that. And we went to different conferences across the country where those universities were and where the partners we wanted to work with were, and sort of built actual relationships with them and got their feedback and sort of like really started to build with them as opposed to just for them in terms of this product. And I think ultimately that made a difference in terms of us getting our first 5. And then from 5 to 15 was way easier than 1 through 5. And then 15 to 30 was way easier than that, and on and on. And to the point where if you start building meaningful relationships with any kind of channel partner and they're part of a cohort, whether it's they're part of, the Ivy League, or they're part of like a specific state schools or whatever it might be, there's a referral element there, which is the best way for you to get new channel partners. And so we started tapping into that and just having earned that ability to be a trusted partner for them. But I think the challenge with channel partners, so all that to say that was sort of how we got going when it came to the schools. The challenge with channel partners is that the time to sale is definitely longer than typically. We've gotten our sales cycle now down to about 60 days, but previously it could take months and months to get people on board. And for us, we see these as long-term opportunities, back to the community a little bit, but really part of our defensibility as a company is this moat that we're building with colleges across the country. If every graduating senior gets our product, downloads our app when they graduate, it's a pretty great way to ultimately like own this market and really be that trusted partner. But it's a lot harder to iterate off of your model if you are moving more slowly in terms of acquiring users, customers. And so I think for B2B companies of any kind where there is a sales cycle, you could have 10,000 users on your platform, learn a ton from them, and they might never come back, but you learn from them pretty easily and you could sort of adapt your product to fit their needs. If you sell one big customer, as you described, even if it's like a 6-figure contract, you might not learn that much about the product and sort of how you need to iterate off of it. It's just a slower process. And so I think it can be very effective if you know exactly what you're supposed to build and you've already had the domain experience or you somehow really understand that space. But if you don't, it's just slows you down a little bit on that iteration and that sort of cycle. And also just puts kind of everything in one basket, which in the early days, I think is tough because you're still trying to figure out exactly the right way to do things. Does that answer your question? You had a couple of other things there.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think, the thing about channel sales or enterprise sales is that often it isn't all eggs in one basket, right? Like if we just get that one deal with Amazon, that'll make our company, and we'll be able to then go raise money and do all the things that we want to do as a founder. And we forget sometimes that smaller deals are just valuable. And universities, I've known many companies that have sort of gone after the university space, and it's a tough space. Did you find that there was a particular department that sort of it resonated with, and then you sort of followed through with that department again and again and again? Or was it really willy-nilly?
Yeah, so it was initially, I love that, willy-nilly. It was very willy-nilly. In the early days, I remember sending first of all, if you're in this sort of business, you should pretty quickly get like HubSpot or Salesforce or some CRM because it just makes your life 10 times easier. But in the early days, I had like Excel documents essentially with people's email addresses and sort of was just sending out these emails one by one. But I think when we started, we kind of cast a wide net. We sent it to every department essentially on campus. And where it started to stick was career services, because that was really the touch point to the real world, where students would get a job and they'd come in and sort of talk about like their salary and compensation, trying to figure all of that out. And then oftentimes the career center would not necessarily have the expertise or the background or a tool to kind of help them think about like budgeting. Okay, well, like if you're making this much money, how does that work into your student loan repayment? How does that work into all these different things? And so they had seen that need. But ultimately, actually, where we landed was somewhere different, because we realized that we were really not focused. Our market was not really students. It was really recent graduates. It was young alumni who were actually dealing with these things in real time. And so we partnered with the Alumni Association. And for them, it resonates really well, because if you think about it, Alumni Association's goal, as it should be, is to make sure you have a meaningful relationship with the school after you graduate, beyond just, donating and sort of volunteering your time and all of that, that you have a positive experience as you're starting out and as you grow as a young adult. And so a lot of the things that they do right now are around like networking and events and sort of engagement and things like that. But what was missing was kind of this, a lot of this practical stuff, like really helping in a meaningful way young people as they navigated this next chapter of their life. So there's just a ton of alignment there, made it a very easy sell, and really just came down to budget in terms of those conversations. But there's a lot of alignment both in pushing it out as well as the users on the other end, like wanting that type of a resource because they were in the place where they realized they needed it. sort of going back to that problem of you don't even know until you don't even know what you need until it kind of hits you in the face, and you're sort of at that teetering point.
So, random question. So you talked earlier about being a foundation in DC and having the opportunity to do this, and I know that's the CASE Foundation.
It is.
Right? Was that Council for Advancement and Support of Education?
It's actually a different one, actually. So it's Steve and Jean Case, who were the early founders of AOL. And so they were just amazing innovators, and obviously did very well at AOL, and have gone on to support all sorts of different causes and have huge philanthropic element to what they do beyond just their investing in startups and sort of building out the ecosystem. And so the CASE Foundation itself, which is now even evolved to the CASE Impact Network, is really all about inclusive entrepreneurship, sort of data-driven approach to just what makes companies grow, like what makes founders able to actually build companies, and sort of all of that. And they've done just a lot of work in the space. And Jean Case was someone who I got to know in business school, who is now, the chairwoman of National Geographic, has a lot of different hats that she wears, but one of them was just an early advisor to Realworld and to me as we were starting out. And she was very generous and allowed me to come in as an entrepreneur in residence when this wasn't even an idea. It was just an idea. It wasn't a company. It didn't have a name or anything like that. So had sort of some time to really ask all of those interviews, do all of that mapping in terms of the thousands of folks who I spoke with, and start to pattern recognition to get us to something interesting.
My first job out of college was at a nonprofit in DC called the Council for Advancement.
Oh, funny.
Yeah,
That's
and then I was a fundraiser in college, and then went to CASE, and then after that went into the industry and was a fundraiser for a number of years. I ran an alumni group, so I definitely understand where you're coming.
That's awesome. I love it.
Yeah, definitely the right direction, right? Because they struggle to add real value, because most of it is just asking for money, and they want to figure out beyond a homecoming what is it really that you can bring to the table. Digress. Let's talk about community, because I think community is super important. Thank you, Ken. There's an interesting thing that you're doing with your business, right? Because in part, Realworld is an expert. We are telling you how things should work, right? Like do X, do Y, do Z. But then you're allowing your community to actually speak to one another and share knowledge and information. How do you keep the quality of the community high? And how do you keep it engaged?
It's a great question. And what I'll say too is that it actually took us a while to realize how important community was. I think we always thought, if you build it, they will come, and sort of the product speaks for itself. And it was really only in the last year, I would say, that we sort of tapped into community, not just as like integral to the product itself, but also as like a moat and sort of defensibility for the business. Because if you have people who are really engaged and who are very excited and are willing to contribute and share their own expertise and knowledge, it just makes it a lot harder for someone to move into that space. And there's companies, just as a digression, there's companies who I think flip it and actually start with community first and then build products for that community. So most notably what comes to mind is Glossier, the beauty and cosmetics brand that initially started as a blog that was just a ton of people really engaged around sort of beauty and content there. And then based upon that information and those sort of perspectives, they ended up building products for that community. And what was magical about it was that they already had their user base ready to go. They had all these people who were really excited about what they were doing because they almost had a part in building it. So we did the opposite, where it really was almost a product-led community, where we started with the product and now we're layering in more and more community elements. So I think the big picture is we still don't totally know yet. And I think the thing that we want to make sure that we do and are trying to be very thoughtful around is not just building a community like for our users, but really building it with them. Because at the end of the day, like community has to be authentic. So you can't just say, okay, like here are the things that we're going to be talking about today, or, trying to really force things on people. You really have to see how do they want to engage. And again, this is sort of a space where there's like some touchy subjects. There's sort of some insecurities just around like being a young adult and asking these different questions. So we're trying to take it slow. But what we can see is that the people who do contribute do provide really high quality content and high quality perspectives. And there's sort of an engagement level there that is almost like you're putting yourself out there the same way you would on LinkedIn or something else. You have a picture next to your name. It's your name. It's sort of really putting yourself out there, as opposed to, I think sometimes on other channels like Reddit or Quora, like you don't really understand, you don't know who that person is who's speaking with you. And our goal as we grow is to really continue to identify experts within those communities who can serve and really be the sort of almost the maintainers of that quality. So for example, one of the things that we haven't really been able to do yet is really focus on local. When we provide information, it's pretty much for the US. It's kind of across the board. We give you some sense when it comes to things like renter's insurance or health insurance, which are states by state specific, where to find resources on those specific states, but we can't really help you with that sort of last mile. And what we want to be able to do is say, okay, if we're trying to help you understand where to find an apartment in Chicago, but we don't really have a presence in Chicago, or we don't really know that region, like let's identify people in our community who do and can kind of contribute more organically there. So the big answer is we're still figuring it out, but we have a couple of like real tenets in place. I think beyond just having people who respect each other on the platform, making sure that there's kind of that basis of knowledge sharing and also just like acceptance of people and everybody trying to better themselves and sort of reach that independence. There's also the idea that we want to empower people to speak about the things that they are experts in, even though we're sort of the expert and the adult in the room. And that people really do have expertise in at least their own experiences around these different things. So even if it's just their own expertise with using a specific type of credit card and what they found was really helpful about it, or what they didn't like about it, or their experience in, filling out certain types of paperwork or whatever it might be. We can always be the moderator, but there's so much more, it's so much more resonant and powerful when it comes from other people who are experiencing it in real time.
So I'll pause again for a minute for questions if there are any, and then we'll veer off slightly as we kind of keep going. All right, just keep going. Again, if you have questions, feel free to come off mute and ask away. Why be an entrepreneur?
Good open question. So I'm a lawyer by background. I am not a technologist. I am not a programmer. I'm not a product manager by background. I really was training to become a lawyer and actually go into public service, and wanted to have an impact I wanted to have an impact with my work, I suppose. And I really entered this space because of this problem, less just the idea of starting a business, because there's tons of ways to make money. There's tons of ways to make impact. I think starting a business is one of the toughest ways to do that. But this problem was just something that I became obsessed with and got really, really excited about, and just realized that there was such an opportunity to create something different and interesting and big that hadn't really been done before. And that my skill sets, despite not being, a product person or a tech person to start, I had some of the other skill sets that would probably be important to something like this. Being a lawyer, just understanding laws, understanding, what you can talk about, what you can't talk about on a platform like this, research, like understanding all of those different things. And I had worked in finance before starting this, and so I had that kind of financial background. And so really it was all about the problem space. And I think the reason why I decided to actually quit my job and start doing it was that there was such an upside to be gained, not only monetarily by being truly the sort of gateway for young people to their lives essentially, but also just such a societal, generational impact if we could do it right. And that is what's kept us going throughout this entire time. We're a very problem and user focused company in the sense that we've spun up 20 different solutions at this point. We had, online video modules, we had conversational text, we had sort of just resources, we had all sorts of different things that got us to our platform now, but it was always going back to the user, always going back to this problem. And so I think that has definitely been the reason why we exist and why we're moving forward and why we're growing. And then personally, I think just there's something exciting about building something from nothing that you don't really get, even if you're building something at, from 1 to 2 as opposed to 0 to 1. There's just such an opportunity to create jobs for people, to create impact for someone you never meet, which is pretty, unusual in terms of your job itself, to build something new and different. And you also just are learning all the time. You're sort of in this constant stage of making mistakes and learning, and making more mistakes and learning from those mistakes and all of that. And so it's been a really exciting journey to be on, exhausting certainly, but an exciting one to be on.
Question from the audience: what's your biggest nonprofit or freeware competitor?
What's our biggest what? Nonprofit?
Profit or freeware competitor?
I don't know. Freeware meaning just like resources that are available.
Yeah, like sort of, is Google your primary competitor right now, or do you?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly would never want to actually like write that on a slide deck that we're competing with Google, because it would be very difficult to compete with them. But I think that there isn't really one out there. I mean, I would say from content sites like NerdWallet probably is top of the list in terms of what they do, but they're a very successful company and they're not a nonprofit. EverFi, from the educational perspective, is an amazing company based in DC that you may have never heard of, but they power a lot of different sort of online tools and learning elements. They're everything from like alcohol EDU to sexual harassment training to some financial literacy on campuses, both K through 12 and then beyond. And they've been wildly successful as well. They're not a nonprofit. I think there's just lots of information out there, but it's just not packaged in the right way. It's sort of what we always come back to. So I'm sure that there are, financial literacy initiatives and nonprofits supporting that type of work. We just focused a little bit differently, I suppose.
What's the biggest challenge that you have faced as an entrepreneur, and how did you overcome it?
I think the biggest challenge, well, I don't know. There's so many, I guess, but I think the biggest thing that I have made mistakes on, and also I'm like always continuing to learn on, is just hiring the right people and making sure that you have the right people around you. Because at the end of the day, this is not like a single person's job. This is really a team job. And particularly in the early stages when you have to figure out so many different things, you kind of have to wear two hats in terms of being both a founder and CEO, because CEOs are supposed to set the direction and you're supposed to just run with it. And it's very hard to do that when you're still figuring out a lot of the things in the early stage. And so that's really like the founder's role, is sort of, inspiring everyone, painting the big picture vision, and kind of like keeping those wheels in motion until you get to that product market fit moment. And I think one of the challenging things for me has just been balancing those two personas in some ways. And making sure that we're continuing to iterate and really like focus on the user and doing these user testing sessions, even if it doesn't actually impact our bottom line, so that we continue to have more of a focus on making the best like world-class product that ultimately will help us grow long term. And then finding people who have that same mindset and bringing them onto the team and sort of inspiring them to do the right, the work that they need to do. Which again just comes back to how important like not only the talent on your team is, but the people that you bring into this business. So investors, advisors, anybody like that, and just making sure that they're excited about what you're doing constantly too.
Given that everybody's remote and sort of the people matter most, what are things that you're doing now to keep everybody engaged and sort of tied to that vision and moving in the same direction?
Yeah, definitely. So we're a highly communicative team. And I think being remote definitely hurts that in some ways, in the sense where we're all always brainstorming and sort of talking through things together and sort of working very quickly. But we've tried to keep the lines of communication very open, just via Slack, via Zoom, stuff like this, having a daily stand-up every morning as opposed to just a weekly stand-up where we kind of go through priorities for the week and go through them. And just also like celebrate the little things that are happening. So when we reach like a new milestone of users, or we get another contract signed, or we do any of these things, just trying to make them a little bit more exciting. And then we also just have like a simple thing, but end of the week, every week, we have a happy hour virtually where we all like play games together. So anything from like Jackbox to code names to other sorts of online games you can play. And it's gotten like pretty competitive, which is really fun over time. So I think just trying to keep the same like culture and semblance of excitement around things is definitely like tough remotely, particularly just in like the crazy environment that we're dealing with COVID, but is really important, obviously. And also we've done, I think it's something you have to nurture, but we've been doing pretty effectively. It's always helpful when you have like the wins to celebrate, because that's when people remember what's going on. And even if those wins are just feedback from users, or having a user testing session, like I mentioned, even the last couple of weeks, and just seeing their eyes light up when they're looking at the product virtually, things like that. You're like, okay, we're doing something good here. Like this person now knows what credit is, and they didn't know before this conversation. So things like that.
So around the idea of celebrating small wins, what's the best thing that's happened to you in the past week?
Best things happened to me in the past week?
You personally.
Me personally, one of our teammates got engaged, which was very exciting. So we got to celebrate her via like sending her champagne and stuff like that yesterday, which was fun. But to me personally, I mean, I think Honestly, just hearing like the feedback of users and just listening to these conversations and seeing their eyes light up, like that's the reason we're in this business, is to make those change. And I think one thing that happened in a user testing session that was pretty awesome was something that we were rolling out that we haven't rolled out yet. We were showcasing our product to this person who had never been on our platform before. And at the end of the conversation, we were sort of out of time, so I didn't have the time to show him this new experimenting thing that we were thinking through. He's like, just one more question for you. Have you guys thought about X? And it was exactly what we were building. And I was like, oh my gosh, yes. Like, I think we've hit on something. If this is something that he wants and we haven't even shown it to him, like that's when you know you're kind of at product market fit or getting close. So I think those types of conversations where I was like, actually, let me show you. Do you have 2 more minutes? I can, share screens and sort of getting that right. I think those are the best things that have happened company-wise. And then just, I think personally, like very grateful to be very healthy right now. It's such a crazy time where people are out of work, they're, sick, there's so much going on. And as crazy as it can be building a business, you have to be very grateful for just the foundational things going right.
So thank you. So my last question before we turn it back over to Andy to wrap up is, in this journey, what has been the most positive surprise? The thing that has made you most happy that you made the right decision?
I think I'm trying to come up with like a very grandiose answer, but I don't know that there is one, to be honest. I think it's a lot of little things. I think it is when someone tells you they've heard of your company and you, like they heard about it separately from, your family and friends, that this is something that's actually in the world and people are using. I think that is like the greatest reward. And then I think I think that plus just some larger institutional players being excited about what we're doing and sort of seeing the value from, 20,000 feet beyond just where we are is always really exciting, because you can just see how if a company that's very well versed in this space in some capacity sees the value and sees the missing element in the market, and they probably really understand the market, that you're kind of onto something and there's sort of value to be had there. But it's really little things. It's really just people getting excited about what you're doing and knowing about it and using it. Like that is the best feeling throughout all of this.
And it's definitely, as a founder, when the first time somebody you don't know says, "Oh,
like,
you with this company,"
I'm like, what? You know it? That's awesome.
Yeah. Especially when they don't know you're part of it, right? And they're explaining the whole thing to you. Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
So I definitely understand experience in that. Thanks so much for the time and great content for folks. Hopefully it was super helpful. I'm going to turn it back over to Andy to wrap up so everybody can go about their day.
Thank you both so much. That was a really fantastic conversation. Genevieve, it was so good to see you again and have you be a part of one of our programs. I was lucky enough to meet Genevieve very early in her in this iteration of the real world, and seeing all of the iterations of how you've progressed over time into what it is now. I got to take a deep dive into the website in preparation for this, and it's just like so phenomenal to see how far it's come. And I have nieces that are in this age range, so I'm really excited to start. I could be probably a channel partner for you, but no, I'm kidding. But thank you again so much. It was really fantastic to reconnect and have you share your experience with our audience. We did record this event, and so we'll be sharing it out through our channels as well. Thank you, Micah, again, for being such a fantastic facilitator for the event. And I've put up our contact information, Micah's, Genevieve's, and myself. So please feel free to reach out to any of us with any questions that you might have. Grasshopper Bank, New York Tech Alliance, the Real World Playbook. Check us out. And again, thank you so much for giving us your time today. And we'll see you hopefully very soon. Thank you and have a great day.